Good evening, friends and family and folks all alike. Today is episode 53 of Lore Lords, and we're going to talk about Armistice Day. Armistice Day. I feel like I'm saying it wrong.
What's that, Pat?
Veterans Day?
Fuck. All right, well, that's the whole episode. So since we know that's done now, it was great listening to you guys. Hope you enjoyed this quick, short episode. No, I'm just joking. Guys, it's a joke. This time. How's your Veterans Day gonna be tomorrow? Tomorrow's Veterans Day.
Yes, I'm gonna wake up, I'm gonna lift weights, and then I'm gonna probably stream again at some point.
Are you not do you not work?
I don't
tomorrow?
work. I have tomorrow
Wow,
off.
that's great. I don't either. So but yeah. It's Armistice Day tomorrow, a.k.a. Veterans Day. We call it Veterans Day in America. Some countries like France call it Armistice Day.
Well, we're not in France, are we?
No.
Are we, Atlas?
Hell no,
Are
dude. We're here in the United States of America. The date as of recording this is 11/10/2022, which makes tomorrow 11/11/2022, which is
the 11-year anniversary of Skyrim.
Is it really?
Yeah, 11/11/11 is when it came out.
Now we know that Skyrim
should have done a Skyrim episode.
Skyrim was a Veterans Day release, apparently. Yeah, it's Veterans Day, and some places call it Armistice Day. They call it that in France. They call it that, I think, in Germany too. But in America, we mix things up, and in 1954. The 83rd U.S. Congress amended the 1938 Act, which made Armistice Day a holiday, replacing the word armistice with veterans to honor the veterans of the Second World War and Korean War.
Right.
So, where does it come from? You may ask. Sitting at your little computer or listening to us on your AirPods or your whatever you're doing. you little rat listening to us.
You little dirty little rat.
Dirty little rat. And where does Armistice Day come from? Well, we're going to answer that tonight. It's a rather lengthy answer. I'm going to tell you that right now.
Oh, okay.
And we're actually going to start by going back to the 1800s because we have to do some backtracking. Because this is going to be on a topic that we've covered twice on this show already with the Verdun and the Somme episodes. But instead of covering a single battle, we're going to be going over the entire state of the world, what led up to it, and what happened immediately after the signing of the armistice on November 11th in 1918.
Okay.
Remember we did an episode a while ago called the World War II Speedrun?
Yes, I do. That was one of mine.
This is that one, but the First World War and a bit more organized. And also, it's gonna be.
Shut
It's gonna be. It's a good setup to understand where the other episodes kind of took place in the overall thing, and also what future episodes I'll be doing, and where they'll take place in the state of the world and this World War, because I consider myself a student of Great War history. It is the part of history I probably understand the best. I have the most knowledge of. And the reason why is honestly just because they didn't teach us in school. And I wanted to know why. No one taught anything. They don't teach anything about World War One. Just the fact that we joined up and won. Like that's basic.
We learned about World War One.
It's so brief compared to the second one. You know, the sequel.
Sure, that's
which
true.
I get it because we were less involved, but it should be taught in depth more equally.
I agree. Yeah.
Especially because of how it influenced the sequel. But we're doing part one to this episode. This episode is 7 parts. It's actually, here's the behind the scenes. It was a 17-page script for this episode. Cut it down to 8. So don't worry.
All right.
It got a lot less beefy.
I unbuttoned my top button to get ready for this.
So part 1, we're going to go to the lead up to understand what happened in the world, how we got to the First World War, because that's also not fucking taught in America. And it starts in 1867, so we're going to go back, which is the founding of a major power of the war, which would be the crux of it all, which started after a war of called the Austro-Prussian War. which could be an entire episode itself. I'll probably never do, and I'm not going to go into it. But it was a major shift in powers of Europe. It was one of the last wars of line fighting that happened with people in their colorful uniforms lining up and shooting on a field. That kind of war.
Yeah,
this was
This was
like the last kind of those wars in 1867.
In hindsight, the lining up in bright colors with guns does feel pretty fucking stupid, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Pretty fucking dumb.
It does.
Why?
It's something we talked about a little bit in the Verdun episode, and we can talk about now, which is basically just because people saw their soldiers as playthings and numbers. So they played it out like a strategy game, like an RTS game today, where you just send your dudes in to stand there and die.
Yeah, I try to avoid that in RTS games now. I literally try to save people. It's so hard to keep people alive.
Yeah, that was that they saying back then too. Man, if only there was some way to not just have everyone die. But this Austro-Prussian War ended and it had a big resolution with the formation of two major powers. These factions would be known as the faction of the war, which is known as the German Confederation, which was made up of a bunch of small German-speaking states. At the end of the war, unified into what would become the German Empire. And the other side of the war, the Austrians ended up confederating the country Hungary and making the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or better known as Austria-Hungary. And this new Austria-Hungary would be ruled by the House of Habsburg, and they would exist until the Habsburg monarchy. We talked about a little bit in the vampire episode, but
and their jawline.
Yeah, and their famous jawline and the Habsburg chin, very inbred. Kind of the reason why all the families are related in England today, or Europe today, is because of the Habsburg. But this is after that had already happened. This is after the Habsburg monarchy ended. They took over
post-incest.
Yeah, probably not. But they ruled over. It's still probably there's still Habsburgs around. One's an F1 racer. The Habsburg monarchy ruled Central Europe for tons of years, hundreds and hundreds of years. They basically were the Holy Roman Empire, became the Habsburg monarchy, then became Austria-Hungary. But this would be no normal country, however, because it was a dual monarchy, which meant both nations of Austria and Hungary would be ruling together with equal shared power.
Not a bad idea. It's pretty progressive for the time.
Yeah. We'll talk about that in a second. They would also control many Slavic people and push their territory further into the Balkans over and over again, claiming Bosnia and Herzegovina as Austria-Hungarian land, which they would finish annexing in the year 1908. Dual monarchy, two countries working together, right? Sounds great. Problem is, it didn't work at all.
Yeah, I had a feeling.
Austria-Hungary was full of eternal strife from the get-go, as it was two very different cultures trying to be forced together, with two very different types of citizens, with very different standards of living, with one being extremely wealthy and one being extremely poor. Austria was one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Hungary is one of the poorest nations in the world. The other biggest
taking after its name, Hungry.
Hungry for money. Back then they were, at least. But then, it didn't work out because despite being called a dual monarchy, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which means there's one emperor king who ruled over two prime ministers. Spoiler, he was Austrian, named Emperor Franz Joseph I. He was a Habsburg, therefore Austrian. He spoke German, which meant that the nation he ruled over would prefer the Austrians and would print documents in German, not Hungarian.
That probably wasn't a problem, right? That wasn't a problem.
No, of course. The Hungarians we don't need to read anything you guys say. Sign laws not in Hungarian, and we just, we'll get it eventually.
Just give us a pat on the back and we're fine.
Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. Most Hungarians didn't speak German.
What?
Weird. They would just know German automatically, which made it a huge problem. And we actually talked about this in the vampire episode when the Habsburg monarchy. It was hard to rule over all these cultures because there's so many different cultures in the Habsburg monarchy, and Austria-Hungary is no different. When you favor one and don't cater to the others, causes a very toxic citizenry. And Austria-Hungary did try more than the previous two iterations. It didn't do a great job at it. But they would get even worse soon because they started swallowing up Slavic countries in the Balkans, like we just mentioned, which now you have a third language, a third culture that you're not supporting.
They get tossed around a lot.
Yeah, they do. Good luck to everyone out there. Anyway, what they did have at their back, however, was strength, not necessarily in itself, but their ally, the German Empire. Now, you've probably heard Europe referred to as a powder keg during this time, right? That's what they say in the books. Yes. It's very fitting. Early 20th century Europe was full of multiple factions based on military alliances that were all at each other's throat and hated each other, just waiting for an excuse to take each other out that would be reasonable enough to justify doing so. And in the 1871 unification of Germany was the first upset to the balance of power. A new major power was formed under one banner that was terrifyingly strong, with a huge army, and now a huge unified industry of the entirety of Central Europe, which in history before this was all individual nations. Like, in the medieval ages and the colonial ages, like, there was no, like, Germany. It was like Saxony and Bohemia, Bavaria, Hamburg. Those are all their own countries. So now they're all one as Germany. And the people of the nation quickly saw the benefit of this and began referring to themselves as German instead of Bavarian or Saxon or Prussian, They all started saying, yeah, we're German. People were behind this unification, which is good for the country's spirit. The opposite of the Austria-Hungary problem. People liked being German. A lot of nationalism started forming in the German Empire during this time.
I wonder if this is a precursor to anything.
A little bit, but not quite as bad at all. Not that level of nationalism, thankfully, for these people.
Okay. The good kind, where it's just kind of like, hey, we want to help our country.
Oh, they definitely thought, yes, but they also did think they were better, but not to a genocide level.
Everyone did at that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. There was no.
That's not a good thing, but.
Yeah. It was a lot. Actually, the German Empire was actually a pretty high equality place for the time. And also back just in terms of their advancement, many of these German nations in the 1860s had sent scouts and observers to the American Civil War. And they watched us kill each other from afar in either balloon or on hills with binoculars. And they saw things like the end of line fighting and trench digging and Gatling guns. And Germany knew where warfare was going. And they started making guns. Good guns, automatic guns, cannons, stuff that people were afraid of. And the fear of this rippled through the nations around them, and they started talking to each other about this threat. In 1894, Russia, out of fear from the Germans, formed an alliance with France. This alliance meant that if one was attacked, the other would come to their defense. Are you laughing at Russia and France being together?
Yeah, yes, I am.
Well,
that's exactly what I'm laughing
at. This isn't the first war. They would be on the same side.
I know, it's just funny.
There's another one coming.
I know.
Yeah. So this military alliance meant that if one was attached, the other would come to their defense. And the reason for this is they were both bordering Germany. The German Empire was on their borders, and they were afraid of them. So this, in response, Germany got scared that this giant Russian Empire and French nation that has a big army, and, Napoleon just happened. So France was powerful. Germany grew ever closer to their one ally, Austria-Hungary. And these two established themselves as a faction known as the Central Powers. With the rapid development of military technology following the American Civil War, each nation would spend huge sums of money on their military, all out of fear of each other.
God damn it, dude. Why can't we just talk? If you just be like, hey, we're not going to attack you guys if you don't attack us. Okay, great. We don't need to build up our armies.
I think they did say that.
Easy peasy.
But it doesn't work. Exactly. They're liars. But despite these two, groups of people being scared of each other and advancing because of it, the people in danger were actually those of southeastern Europe, where not just Austria-Hungary, but also Russia had eyes on the land there. Austria-Hungary had already established itself a foothold here in 1908, like we mentioned before, by annexing Bosnia and Herzegovina. And now they had their sights set on this other tiny country, Serbia.
Oh, that's where Don's from.
It is. Don, shout outs to Don, our viewer and Serbian. Britain was the world's leading power at this time. They had a strict policy of maintaining the balance of power in Europe, and Germany was growing too fast in a bid to claim the title of great power for themselves, and Britain took notice. The British decided instead to ally with their former enemy, the French, in 1904, which for the first time, because before this, they were better friends with the Germans than the French. And then, their other mortal enemy, they decided to ally with the Russians in 1907, all out of fear of Germany's growing power.
I just love how, I mean, they're just such different nations all joining together. It's like, you guys don't get along at all.
I know. They're actually former mortal enemies, and they're all still... Britain's a constitutional monarchy. France is a democratic republic. Russian's an empire. So those are three different types of government. Granted, Britain was basically the same as France. They're both democratic. But, Russia they were a monarchy at the time. So they joined up, and they made their faction called the Triple Entente, also known as the Allies. This upset the German Empire. The Allies. We're going to be calling them the Allies for the rest of this episode. This upset the German Empire, who was now encircled by enemies. The German nationalists viewed Britain as a barrier to their global ambitions to leave Europe, and the generals feared the military threat of the Russians. The Germans had another very close ally called the Ottoman Empire, which spanned most of the Middle East and was based in modern-day Turkey. They had recently sold 2 large ships to them, which were crewed by German sailors under the command of a German admiral, lending their power to the Ottomans, which would be a major influence to them on the German side of things. We'll talk about a little more in a bit.
I always forget about the Ottomans, and then it's just like, oh yeah, that was a huge fucking deal for a long time.
Yeah, the Ottoman Empire was one of the longest lasting empires, and it was the same one for the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Same one.
Which is insane.
And I
keep forgetting about it.
Yeah. They weren't doing too good. Same problems as Austria-Hungary. No. Too many cultures under one banner. Too many people.
Right.
Too many different dialects. The Middle East is not one people. There's not just Persians.
Oh, yeah.
Despite how much they wanted, there's a bunch of different types of people there. So Ottomans tried to claim it all for their own, just like Austria-Hungary did in Europe, and it didn't work out.
Yeah. Not good.
Come 1914... tensions are high and the world is waiting all over on the precipice of war. People just know it's coming. Everyone knows it's coming. They just don't know when. The world, however, didn't know what they were in for. A conflict the world has never seen the likes of, and quite frankly, hasn't seen the like since. Now we're going to go to part 2. The war begins. We've caught up. We're in 1914. The powder keg, as they say, is set up, and the spark is about to be lit.
It's lit.
On the famous...
That's a horrible thing to say, is lit. Is World War I.
It's lit, guys. The party's going to get started.
We're going to miss out an entire generation of people.
Yeah, the lost generation. On June 28th, 1914, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne, was shot to death along with his wife, Sophie, by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. And Princip was a Serbian who was allegedly part of a secret military society called the Unification of Death, or the Black Hand, who was actively trying to end Austro-Hungarian rule over Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Well, good job, pal.
Yeah. The assassination set off a rapid chain of events in Austria-Hungary. They blamed Serbia for the attack, despite it being a single person who was part of a radical group that was not affiliated with the Serbian government, which Serbia made very clear, we don't know who this guy is. He is not a soldier.
All right.
This would be seen as a chance for Austro-Hungarians to finally end the question of Serbia, to annex the nation into theirs, just like Bosnia and Herzegovina before it. Russia, however, had already voiced previously that they would support Serbia and help them remain independent from aggressors if they were attacked. Austria-Hungary could not take on Russia. They knew this. They knew Russia was bigger than them and they had no chance against it. So what they did was they sent a letter and waited for a response from Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany to voice his support for their cause, being confident that if they had the backing of Germany, Russia wouldn't come at them. So, on July 5th, Kaiser Wilhelm secretly pledged his support to Austria, giving the Austria-Hungarian carte blanche support, basically meaning blank check, which assured that Germany would back the country in case of war in whatever they needed. Austria-Hungary would send demands to the Serbian government that were allegedly impossible to accept due to how harsh they were, and assuming the invasion was coming, Serbia readied its armed military and sent word to the Russians. On July 28th, almost a month later, Austria-Hungary would declare war on Serbia, and the fragile state of Europe shattered. Within a week, Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary, Germany declared war on Russia, France declared war on Germany, Belgium declared war on Germany, Great Britain declared war on Germany.
God damn, dude.
1 week after that, 2 German ships sold to the Ottoman empires that we mentioned earlier, under the order of German admirals, raided Russian ports in the Black Sea, which led to Russia declaring war on the Ottoman Empire, and Ottoman Empire signing up with membership to the Central Powers, then declaring war on Great Britain and Serbia.
Man, it really all popped off at once, didn't it?
2 weeks. 2 weeks for all those war declarations to happen. The world was at war, and it was about to get really bad really fast. The first part we're going to cover is the Western Front, because we already did 2 episodes on everything about it, so I'm just going to do another short little summary of that.
Sure.
German top field marshal Alfred von Schlieffen had come up with a plan known as a Schlieffen Plan, which we talked about in that episode as well, which was the idea of fighting on 2 fronts, which, if you know anything about this war and the sequel, familiar idea.
Kind of a big concept.
Yeah,
for both of them.
They would invade France through Belgium in the west while confronting Russia in the east. And on August 4th, 1914, the German Empire entered Belgium, marking the first battle of the war in the city of Liege. It would be heavily assaulted using their most powerful siege cannons, which were seen by the world for the first time, and by August 15th, almost 2 weeks later, they would take the city, and they would march through Belgium in an event known historically as the Rape of Belgium.
Yeah, they have a lot of those in the world, and it's very sad.
This is the thing that established the world viewing Germany as a evil empire due to the wake of death they left, with shootings and executing civilians, publicly executing a Belgian priest for, quote, inciting civilian resistance, unquote. When the French troops first engaged the Germans, it wasn't even considered a battle. The lines of bright blue French uniforms marched in traditional line fashion to battle as they would before, but none of them got to even see enemies as the German artillery fire completely wiped out the French forces.
Jesus Christ.
This sent a message to the world that the old ways were over, and the new ways were beginning with the age of technology and inventions for the most terrible machinations of war we've ever seen. The Germans
that must have been absolutely horrifying.
Yeah. So basically what happened is, if you want to imagine it, there was a large open field, right? And the French were in line in three battalions of French lined up going through. And there was 2 mountains, and those mountains were covered in massive artillery cannons, which fired at the giant blue moving people because they were giant and blue and very visible, and they all got destroyed. It wasn't, the French didn't get to fire a shot. And the Germans would successfully punch through northern France and move in until the First Battle of the Marne, where they met not only the French, but the British, who would stand up to stop their army within 30 miles of Paris. And we mentioned it in the Somme and Verdun episodes before, but it's important to remember the British troops were the only veteran army at this time. They had just fought a war in Africa, and all their troops had veteran sergeants, they had veteran leaders. They were very good at fighting, and they proved it with this. They had a much smaller force than the French, but they were much more elite, and they destroyed the Germans in their first combat.
Man, it's just wild.
Yeah. And they stopped the Germans only 30 miles away from Paris.
Jesus Christ.
Luckily for the Allies, the counterattack was a success and the Germans were pushed back, and this was huge. And unlike the sequel we know so well, the German fast attack to take France was a failure.
Right.
This was when both sides would dig in on opposite sides of the Aisne River, and this is where we saw the troops dig in their trenches and begin the wars, and we can basically stop talking about the Western Front because we already did 2 episodes on it.
Yep.
After they dug in, it led to the Battle of Verdun, and after that, the Battle of the Somme, which we covered in extreme detail. If you want to go listen back to those ones,
I like the Somme one a lot just because of the trench details that you put up.
Yeah, the trench.
Those are cool.
Yeah, we showed pictures, which you can look up. I showed you how to look it up and stuff too. Cool episodes. I actually really like those ones. Yeah, but to sum up those battles real quick, 2 million dead. It's a lot. It's a lot of people.
Yeah.
For warfare. 2 million. Most World War I coverage will talk about the Western Front and those 2 major battles and their inventions of trench warfare. But what about the rest of the world during the war? It was a world war, remember? There was other things happening. Yeah, it wasn't
Mexico wasn't doing anything.
A little bit. Not really. Part 2. The Eastern Front. On the other side of Europe, the Eastern Front was where we saw the giant army of the Russian beast go to war against not just Germany. Part 3? Part 3, yeah. Part 3. You're good. You caught me.
I'm paying attention.
That's good. So Russia would go against not just Germany, but also Austria-Hungary. But first, let's look into Austro-Hungarian troops and how they were doing in Serbia. Spoiler, not very well.
Oh, okay.
Much like the French, the Austro-Hungarian military was that of the Old World, and they heavily relied on cavalry, using line fighting tactics in the last century, and this would not work. If you have looked at Serbia in a map, it is heavily mountainous. And not to mention, Serbia had been getting weapons from other parts of the world, such as Russia, and already adapting to the new military ways. There is one very famous moment often told to show how outclassed the Austro-Hungarian military was and stuck in their old ways. When they lost a battle in Serbia against a force, they had about 1,200 men and lost to 350 Serbians due to the use of hand grenades, which the Austrians didn't know what they were.
Yeah, that must have been scary. All of a sudden, these little the hand grenades back then were they the stick-like ones?
Yeah, they were stick grenades.
What was that?
They were stick grenades.
Stick grenades? Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, they would just land and be like, huh, what's this thing? And then, explode. And they just kept falling from the sky and didn't know what the hell was going on. So that happened. Eventually, the German military would give them stuff to help them out. But the Germans, the French, everyone was fully equipped with these weapons, but Austria just simply didn't know what they were, which is hilarious. It's even said that the start of the war, the Austrian cavalry had lances, but they never ended up actually fielding them against the Serbians. They would against the Russians later, but not the Serbians. Soon enough, however, with German support, they would be able to push back and take over all of Serbia, where the Serb army would retreat through Greece, eventually striking back and fighting a trench warfare against the Kingdom of Bulgaria, who would join the Central Powers. In 1918, there was a thing called the Vidar Offensive, where the French troops showed up to help the Serbians retake Serbia, which ended up opening a way to the eventual capitulation of not only the Kingdom of Bulgaria, but Austria-Hungary. The German Emperor Wilhelm II even has a telegram to the Bulgarian Tsar Ferdinand I stating, quote, disgraceful, ! 62,000 Serbs decided the war, ! One of the reasons Serbia would be eventually retaken was the Russian offensive, because Austria-Hungary would have to move most of their troops out to stop the Russians, and Germany had to do the same in the north of Europe. Russia would invade East Prussia and Poland held by the Germans, but were stopped by German and Austrians at the Battle of Tannenberg in late 1914. Despite the Central Powers' victory, Russia forced Germany to move its troops from the Western Front to the east, which is one of the reasons the Germans failed to take Paris in 1914, and we did talk about in the Verdun and Somme episodes how they kept having to move German troops to fight the Russians. The Allied forces proved much more formidable than the Germans expected, and they underestimated Russia's ability to mobilize their massive millions of military men so quickly. And this caused a longer, much more grueling conflict instead of a quick victory promised by the Schlieffen Plan. From 1914 to 16, Russia would mount several offenses on the front, but they could never break through German lines, and they would cycle through so many troops, they ended up having a total of 1,811,000 total military deaths. including 1,500,000 civilian deaths. Or sorry, separately 1,500,000 civilian deaths.
Jesus Christ.
And this is a problem. This caused a huge problem in Russia. Economic instability took over. All their peasants died in this fighting, so they had a huge food scarcity. The Russians were also losing basically every single battle, so even to the Austrians, due to their starvation and exhaustion.
I mean this in the most non-offensive way possible, but how is Russia even still around?
You're right.
Like, just
and so big. Like, and so big.
Yeah. It's so big.
It's big.
Gotta be the only reason. It's because
so many
big.
people. So many people in Russia.
Just like, but there's just so many instances throughout history. It feels like every 30 years they go through some kind of absolute garbage shit show.
Yeah.
Like,
get your fucking shit together. Anyway, so what this led to, as you probably know, workers and peasants took it they got at the worst end of this. And they would direct this towards the Russian Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra, who was German.
Yep.
And this would explode in 1917 when this little-known figure known as Vladimir Lenin led a force known as the Bolsheviks' Red Army against the White Russian forces and ended the Tsarist rule of Russia. This successful coup in the new Red Russia would sign an armistice with the Central Powers in December of 1917, which freed German troops in the east, meaning a lot more trouble for the troops in the west, because they now only had one front to deal with.
Yep.
South of all this action, we had another power called the Ottoman Empire, which we talked about, who ruled over the Middle East. Just like the Austria-Hungary, however, it struggled from its own internal strife, like we brought up, and they were also kind of surrounded, because in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, they were constantly fighting against British troops. But the British wanted control of the Dardanelles. This is the Strait of the Sea that links the Sea of Marmara with the Aegean Sea. Very important waterway to control, held by this very powerful fortress city called Istanbul.
Oh yeah.
They would fail the first attack in 1914. Failure trying to take this as a surprise attack at the beginning of the war. So they came back in 1915, beginning what was known as one of the biggest military disasters in history, which I will cover in another episode in detail, called the Invasion of Gallipoli. British commanders would take control of the Australian and New Zealand forces, known as the Anzac, and lead them into a crushing defeat at Gallipoli, where the Allied forces would end up having to full retreat in 1916 after suffering 250,000 casualties, most of them being Australian and New Zealand soldiers who were there not of their own will and not being allowed to be commanded by their own kind.
I think I've actually heard of this before. I think I had somebody from Australia told me this.
Yeah, it is a huge thing. There's a very famous saying in Australia called "Never Another Gallipoli," which basically is like their independence saying.
Yeah, because wasn't this like the start of them really separating from? Yeah.
So after this, the Anzac forces kind of were like, "Hey, listen, like we need more independence," and they got it. In the Second World War, they were still part of the British, but they weren't controlled like this. They got a lot more freedom. Yeah. And I'm not going to go much more detail into that because I am going to do an episode. It's probably going to be my next battle episode of World War I will be Gallipoli because it's a crazy story. And now we're going to go into part 3. Part 4. We're going into part 4, which is Italy. Because Italy is a very interesting part of the First World War. Because when the war was started, the Kingdom of Italy, led by King Victor Emmanuel III, would agree to join the Central Powers, along with Germany and Austria-Hungary, in what was known then, with their joining, as the Triple Alliance. They would, however, remain neutral when all these wars were declared, deciding not to join the others in the field. However, there was a huge sentiment within Italy that wanted to go to war against their now ally Austria-Hungary because they were historical enemies, and they owned several pieces of territory from the Trentino region of the Alps to the Trieste region of the northern end of the Adriatic Sea, which are Italian and speak Italian. Also, during the pre-war years, Italy had warmed up to two new friends, France and Britain, due to very lucrative trade deals. And this meant a lot of the people felt closer to them than the Central Powers. So, on April 26th of 1915, we saw for the first time, really, in these big war histories, Italy negotiated the Secret Pact of London, where they changed sides. by which Great Britain and France pledged full support for Italy in annexing their frontier lands in return for entering the war on the side of the Allies. And on May 3rd, they officially left the Triple Alliance, and on May 23rd, declared war on Austria-Hungary.
That is a huge deal, because that's such a strategic underbelly, that whole area.
Italy just like switched sides mid-war. And the first Battle of Isonzo took place in late spring of 1915, where Italy would attempt to retake the Italian-speaking regions of Austria-Hungary, which again are historically Italian. Isonzo would be a horrific, bloody series of 12 battles at the top of the Alps and down low by the river Isonzo. The Italians' goal would be to go over the Alps, granting them not only access to Vienna, but reclaiming their territory. The Italians would push repeatedly and lose the Austrians time and time again, until eventually German troops arrived to support the Austrians, which forced Italy into a full retreat, and the Isonzo campaign was a terrible failure. It would see a total of 1.5 million soldiers killed or wounded or captured on both sides. One of the biggest things in this battle was gas weapons. Gas was being used across the war, but we saw a high use of mustard and white gas attacks during this battle. And here's the thing. It took place in the top of the Alps. A lot of wind going on up there. So when gas clouds were formed, it would blow for miles sometimes, just covering villages of civilians, towns of people just getting coated in chemical gas. And it was diluted by being spread so far to the point where it wasn't inherently deadly, but it would cause health effects for life, including a lot of people becoming sterile from the white gas.
I'm sure.
Over 700,000 people would die from chemical weapons in these battles.
Jesus Christ.
And that's where we're going to end our part 4 of Italy and go on right to the next one as we keep going into part 5, which I titled Seas and Skies, because I want to talk about technology in this war. Because we talked about it a little bit during the trench warfare thing.
I just love how you ended that last part. Everyone got gassed and everyone died. Next part, it's like, oh,
yeah.
okay.
Well, to get a little more clear on that as well, just so people understand it, the Austrians also could not push off the Alps. They couldn't get into Italy. It was too well defended. Right. Both sides were too well defended, and the Austrians were much better mountaineers than the Italians were at the time, and they were trained in mountain warfare a lot more than the Italians were, which is one of the reasons why they couldn't lose. Which we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the need for specialist troops in the next section, because specialist troops are very important, and I'm going to talk about Star Wars. But before that, we're going to go about Sea and Skies.
Okay.
Because before the war broke out, Great Britain, naval supremacy around the world. Probably heard that before.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they ruled it. They owned
for a long time.
Yeah, long time. Kind of still next to us.
Right.
And they're all over, including Australia, New Zealand, British Malaysia at the time. They had a big presence on that side of the world, and of course they had the UK. They had Egypt, was a British country at this time, British state.
Oh yeah.
So they had a lot of powerful naval bases all over the world, including Gibraltar as well, in the bottom of Spain.
Oh.
So it would be challenged for the first time, however, by none other than Germany, who made huge advances in closing the gap between the two naval powers. The Imperial German Navy did not have as many large ships as the Royal British Navy, but what they did have was the new deadly invention of the U-boat.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That thing's not good. Isn't the U-boat one of the reasons why we got involved?
Yes, it is. We're going to talk about that soon. That's actually the last part of this is the Americans, because, for reasons obvious. The submarine in World War I was not a place you wanted to be on either side of, because they were, they're bad in the sequel. You've seen movies and stuff of Germans and Soviets and their submarines and how cramped they were. Now imagine 1915.
Yeah, they were closets. You were in like a closet with people.
They barely had electricity. Now imagine being underwater, but you can't light a gas lantern without exploding, so you have to use these very, very weak powered light bulbs. The technology for stopping them at the same time didn't exist, which led to German submarine supremacy. and the only naval advantage to the Germans. In the January of 1915, at the Battle of Dogger Bank, the Brits would successfully ambush the German fleet at the North Sea, crushing the entire German navy almost at once.
Oh my god.
After this, they decided to never engage the British at sea again unless absolutely necessary, but would rely on U-boat supremacy for the rest of the war. But unfortunately, it did become absolutely necessary very quickly in 1916 in May, where the biggest naval battle of the entire war took place, called the Battle of Jutland, which is where British and German navies would again collide in the North Sea in a bid for the Germans to break the Allied blockade, which would end up cementing the fact that the British had a superior navy in another crushing defeat on the German side.
That should be a movie. That would be good.
I believe there is.
Okay.
I think it's old, though. I think it's like a 70s movie. Should be remade. But the advances in submarine technology and ship systems was not the only major advancement in mechanical warfare, because for the first time, we saw war in the skies.
Yeah, I love these stories. I mean, besides people dying and stuff, but
Fights
are cool.
Yeah, we also talked about it in the Somme episode, how these guys were based, these pilots were the equivalent of knights. They were the knights of that age. Right. So, they were heroes. They were celebrities. It was in World War II as well, just not quite as prominent. There were
more of them.
Yeah, there was more of them, exactly. And we all know who the Red Baron is. Besides the pizzas he makes, he's a really good fucking pilot. Which we talked all about his fate and his story in the Somme episode, if you want to listen to that. The ability to harness the power of planes was a new thing, and it was not impactful at this stage of the war in comparison to the Navy, but budding air forces would make their debut on the world stage in World War I. With aviation being a new field, the first aircraft taking flight only 11 years before the war by the Wright brothers in 1903. Aircraft were initially used for reconnaissance missions using binoculars, but in June of 1912, the United States, because who else, successfully mounted machine guns on a plane.
That would be an American thing to do. Can I put a gun on it?
Yeah. And they could, and they did. But it was imperfect because the machine gun would shoot the propeller of the plane.
I like that. I mean, I don't like that, but yep.
Yeah. So
figured this out.
It was a rough thing. They did. The first way of figuring this out would be the French, who solved it by making the Morane-Saulnier L, a plane that had armored deflector wedges on the propeller, which was able to stop bullets from hitting it. So bullets would still hit it technically, but it would literally bounce them off. So you could fire through your propeller.
Right.
This would be used by the French and British Royal Flying Corps, as well as the British Royal Navy, and even the Russian Air Service would see these planes.
It's a waste of bullets, though.
Yeah, but some got through, and that's what mattered. A Dutch inventor named Anthony Fokker improved the French deflector system with his invention of a device known as the interrupter.
Yeah.
This device would be plugged into the machine guns and the engines connecting them, and the firing of the guns with the plane's propellers would stop to avoid collision, and it would synchronize them together.
I remember looking this up on my own once because I wanted to know how they did it.
I did the same exact thing, too. I think I was seeing a World War I movie on TV when I was a kid, and I was like, how do they not blow their propellers off? Yeah, the synchronizer.
I think I was watching
Interrupter.
Dunkirk, and I was like, how do they do that?
Dunkirk's the next war. But
I know, but they have those guns and the thing in the front, and it stops the rotator.
They do, yeah. The Germans did still use the front guns. Most people went to wing guns, but Germans kept them in the front. He would end up so Anthony Fokker ended up making over 40 different kinds of planes for the German Empire.
Dick.
Yeah. 40 kinds of planes. That's a lot for a single war, dude.
That's a lot of fucking planes.
Yeah.
You gotta try stuff out.
Yeah, exactly. It's literally what it was. What if you put 4 wings on it? What if you made the wings have a division in the middle? What if you put 2 wings in the bottom?
I've seen all those. I've seen those. Fucking, there's tons of pictures.
There's
of those.
there's the British in London. I believe outside of London, there's a big museum of World War I aircraft, and they have all of them on display.
That's so cool.
And they're some weird looking ones.
I'd love to see that. Actually, that'd be fun to go to.
Planes with machine guns, of course, would lead to planes with other weapons, such as bombs. And while bombers came in many sizes and shapes, from actual drop windows underneath the second seat or even the pilot seat, to simply pilots or passengers dropping bombs off the side by hand, they would prove to be devastatingly powerful. While the Allies debuted the first bomber, called the Handley Page HP 0/400, the Germans would be the first to introduce a heavy bomber designed to blanket the enemies in as much explosives as could physically fit while still being able to fly. And this was called the Gotha GV. Yeah, the Gotha GV. These things were devastating. We talked about them a bit in the Somme episode as well, as they just pelted the Allies with bombs. But these didn't enter until the late stages of the war in 1917. Before this, we saw the German Zeppelin, which would be primarily a bomber, but they were pretty easy to shoot down because they moved rather slowly. And while the balloons were armored, eventually with enough fighters attacking them, they would go down. Anti-aircraft guns didn't really exist at this time, so they just had to shoot them with machine guns from the trenches, usually would shoot upwards. So when the Zeppelin showed up, they were usually too high up for machine gun bullets to hit, so you had to use enemy fighter craft to take them out, or your fighter craft to take them out.
I think there was an old computer game I used to play that was like a World War I shooter, and there was like one of the missions was take down a Zeppelin, and you had to basically like not avoid German fighters while taking.
Was it called Crimson Skies?
Maybe.
That's I think it's an alternate history game, but yeah, it's all World War I shit, and you're like flying and taking out Zeppelins. I remember that being a thing. I love that game. Also, Battlefield 1, great example of how devastating Zeppelins can be. You ever played that game?
I've seen the glitch of it with the thing spinning out really, really fast and then disappearing.
Yeah. Also, how devastating they can be crashing because they're, as Hindenburg happened. Think of that on the battlefield.
Yeah.
So.
Oh my God! Yeah, absolutely. Like
they were literally just
covers
fireballs.
an area in rubble.
Yeah.
Yeah. God,
so
what a fucking imagine being assigned to one of those. Like, hey, you're going to the Zeppelin. It's like fuck.
Yeah. I don't know how many even survived, honestly, because they went down. Yeah.
like okay. Oh God. Okay.
And to end off this section, while the Germans had great aces such as the Red Baron, it would actually be the Allies who won out the war in the skies, producing up to 5 times as many aircraft than the Germans. The British creating an air force at the end of this war, being the first air force ever on April 1st, of 1918, known as the Royal Air Force or the RAF.
Still to this day, is that what they're called?
Yeah,
right?
Still the Royal Air Force. It's still the RAF. It's just that they were the first ever air force to exist. Before that, it was just like, here's a couple planes in the army. Good luck. It wasn't new enough. It was too new. It wasn't known enough to make an air force. So, yeah.
But now it's like, oh, this is
now it is what matters more than anything else.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And I was about to say the two biggest things are still Navy and Air Force. Basically
100%.
If you have those two things,
and one of the reasons why the Navy is so important is they have their own Air Force. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, going on to the next part. What is this? Is this part 6 or 5? Which one is it?
I think this is 6.
I think it might be 6 or 5. I don't remember. Asia in the First World War, guys. Here we are. Asia, not talked about in the World War. Basically ever. No one ever talks about leaving Europe in World War I.
Yep, because why would you?
Why would you talk about non-white people? So we're going to talk about that for a moment. In Asia. Well, I mean, it's true. It's hard truth. Whitewashed World War One. There a lot of stuff happened in Asia. A lot of stuff happened.
A lot of stuff was whitewashed.
Yeah, 100%. But we might talk about Asia a bit more in the future, but we're going to talk about Asia, and we're going to in the Pacific Theater and specialty troops. The reason why it's not talked about in reality isn't due to whitewashing. It's due to it just had a smaller impact on everything else going on.
Right.
But it was a world war, so the whole world was involved. And mostly this had to do with multiple rebellions with nations such as British Malaya had a huge rebellion, which was Ottoman funded. And there was also German and Austrian colonies that existed in China and other places in the Pacific. It seems weird to think of now of Germany having land in Asia, but they did, because remember, they were a huge empire, and they had a lot of African and a lot of Asian land.
It makes a lot of sense. Like, you want to disrupt operations of your enemies in any way, so you're going to send things to places all over the world. So it's like, yeah, Britain and Germany both had nations on the other side of the world, so they're like, well, let's fuck with it. Like, let's make sure that they have to focus on some of their resources on the other. Like, imagine like being like, okay, we have to focus on the border of Italy, and then all of a sudden you're like, fuck, we got to send people to Malaysia. God damn it! Like, that sucks.
Yeah, no, it's they're very right, and that's exactly kind of what happened. And also just to bring up Africa, because I did not give Africa its own section. I included it in this one. Africa at this time didn't really have countries, sadly. It was entirely Europe countries that ruled over Africa. If you looked at a map of Africa in World War One, I think it's all just different. It's like Germany, Britain, France, Belgium, just giant marks of that on the map. There was a couple of small African countries, but they didn't get involved. What did get involved was these colonial powers fighting each other, but it was mostly just border skirmishes. Because of basically what you said, they wanted to have their armies elsewhere, and also it was so hard to fight in the environments of Africa, they didn't want to. It's such a rough land. They're just like, they just kind of guarded their own borders. That's all. They were just border skirmishes when they did a couple battles, but nothing really important. And going back into Asia, one of the first ever land battles in the Pacific was the invasion of German Samoa, which took place on the 29th to 30th of August in 1914. I don't think so, because it's a very...
Not in Lore Lords, but I think we talked about it.
We very much might have. What happened was New Zealand sent their military against the Germans, and the campaign ended without a single death. After 1,000 New Zealand troops landed and took the Germans by surprise at night, the German small force simply dropped their guns and raised the white flag.
That's right. We did talk about this once, I think.
And Germany had many small islands in the Pacific, and the AN and MEF, which is a combination of Australian, New Zealand, French, and British forces, would scramble through the Pacific to contain the threat. And this is where we're going to talk about Star Wars. So, Star Wars Rogue One and Andor show a type of trooper called a shore trooper. Now, besides shore troopers looking cool, a lot of people shit on Star Wars for shore troopers, saying that's crazy, it's way too specific. Why would there be troops for tropical things in a space world? This is exactly why. And what happened in the First World War is Germany didn't have those. They did not have a military trained to exist in tropical lands. They did not have any training on how to sneak in sand, how to deal with the heat. Nothing. It was just garrison forces. You know who did? Australia and New Zealand. They were masters at tropical warfare, and what that meant is they just fucking destroyed the Germans. And this is why specialist troops are important. Mountaineers in Austria, tropical experts in the Southeast Asian places by the Anzac forces. This is why you have to have specialty troops. And everyone's shitting on Star Wars for shore troopers. This is why.
No. I never heard that complaint before.
Oh, I did.
I didn't know people were doing that.
When Rogue One came out, there was a bunch of people being like, because Star Wars is political and neckbeards like to hate it. And when Rogue One came out to complain about a movie with a female protagonist and not sound sexist, they liked to say that it was because shore troopers existed.
That's so nitpicky. Of course you're
100%.
Sexist,
Yeah, I saw that. I haven't seen this in years. I just remember when it first came out, people were like, they have beach troopers now? Like sand troopers weren't.
Yeah.
Yes, they do. Yeah, they do.
Yes, they
and
do.
Guess what? People do in real life, too. They literally have the Marine Corps for a fucking reason. Anyway.
I was going to say, have you seen our military?
Yeah.
We have, mountain fighters, beach fighters. We have fucking everything.
Yeah, you have to have specialist troops. And the Germans didn't, because they thought they didn't think about this happening. And sure enough, they lost all their assets and all their supplies in the Pacific, which was a lot of rubber that they needed.
God, I'm so mad about the Rogue One stuff now. I didn't even... I just like that movie. I didn't know people didn't like it, really.
Fucking fantastic. Oh, everyone fucking likes that movie, generally. It's a great movie.
It's so good.
No one hates on that movie nowadays, especially after the last three big movies.
Yeah, well.
Anyway, the Battle of Bitapaka was another big one with a German controlled New Guinea back then, and the Australians sent 500 troops against a garrison of 300 Germans, and they pushed the Germans out of the island. The remaining German pockets would keep fighting back a little bit, but when they actually met the Australian troops, they capitulated without fighting. Now, this was the end of the Pacific Islands, and they were secured for the Allies thanks to the Anzac forces.
Well, it was a world war, but doesn't mean all the world parts were big, like you said.
Yeah, but it did cut out a lot of resources from Germany. So.
Oh, sure.
Also, the German Navy at the beginning of the war did try to go through America, through Cuba. Sorry, not Cuba, Panama. They tried to get through, that area, They tried to go around the Cape of South America, but was the Panama Canal around then? I don't even, was it?
I'll look up when the Panama Canal was made. Let me look.
Because I don't know if it was actually. Because I'm realizing now they did try to go through
so.
South America. The Panama Canal was either a work in progress or not done yet.
Completed in 1914.
Okay, so it was just finished. Yes, they did try to go through it.
Finished.
However, Allied interests in Panama didn't let the Germans go through, so they tried to go around the bottom, and they got to the Falklands, which are British islands, and they got destroyed by the British Navy there. So the German Pacific Fleet never got back to Germany, and they never got to go back to support the Atlantic forces.
Womp womp. That's actually brutal. What a no, you can't. Like, the only safe passage they had was the Panama Canal, and Allies were like, no.
They just closed it for the Germans, and then they're like, okay, we can go around, but then that takes you past the Falklands, which is, to this day a British nation with a navy. Yeah. The most significant stronghold, however, we're going to talk about next, which is China, which is a very interesting place in the First World War, also not talked about.
Yeah, I actually don't think I know anything.
So the German government during this time was accused of being behind a monarchist coup that took place in China that tried to make Zhang Shun, a Chinese general who was leading this monarchist coup, who wanted to give the throne back to Emperor Pu to get to bring back the Chinese Empire. But the coup, if successful, would make China on the side of Germany, which is why everyone's pretty sure the Germans funded it, and it would be a huge boon to the Central Powers to have China on their side. Unfortunately for them, the coup would fail, and a pro-war faction led by Yuan Chi-Rui would end up winning, and the Allies got the support of China instead, which meant the Chinese weren't too happy about Germany owning a piece of China. The most significant German stronghold in Asia was called Sing Sao, which was a Chinese territory, and the area was defended by 3,650 German troops, 100 Chinese locals, and a small amount, around 20 to 45 Austro-Hungarian troops. This base would be attacked by a joint effort by the British, who were supporting their new ally and member of the Allies, the Imperial Japanese Navy, who would invade the fortress on November 6th of 1914. 703 Germans would die in this battle against the Japanese, who would take 3,600 prisoners. The Allies lost 2,066 men, mostly Japanese, and they lost one ship. The Austro-Hungarian forces, however, did manage to scuttle every single German ship, which meant the Allies didn't get any of them.
Whoa.
The Allied victory, however, did assure their dominance over Asia and the Pacific, and while China and Japan were now part of the Allies, they didn't really do anything about sending troops to the Western Front. Japan ended up sending a lot of supplies to help out the French and British, but what China did was they sent labor forces to the Western Front who would help build the trenches.
Oh.
So that they sent
huge.
laborers. Yeah, they were a huge help. There was a lot of them died. In fact, I think all of them did, but they did help build the Western Front to stop the German advance. Now we're going on to part 6, which I counted, by the way. That was part 5. So now we're on to part 6, which we're starting in 1914, back again, where America enters the war. Not 1914, but that's what we're going to talk about.
Let's go, baby.
America didn't want to join the war in 1914 because it was a Eurocentric war, and there was an early sentiment amongst the population of people to help out the UK financially, mostly due to their backgrounds. A lot of Americans have Anglo-Saxon descent.
What?
At the time, there was a large wealthy faction, however, who supported the Germans, saying they didn't ask for war, and it was their ally, the Austro-Hungarians, who thrust it upon them, and that these wealthy people were also of German descent, and they were also anti-Tsarist and wanted to see the Russian Empire fall.
It's so intricate and involved.
Yeah, it's so involved. These are the American camps, which were not even in the war. This is this American sentiment at the time. Despite all this, the sentiment for neutrality did win out, which was backed by the large amount of Irish and Scandinavian Americans, as well as the church and the support of American women, which, while they couldn't vote at the time, they did, hold rallies and speak about things. America also had a pre-war negative view of the Kaiser and his new empire due to how they armed themselves so quickly, looking like they wanted to go to war. And this further escalated their dislike of Germany when they heard about the atrocities they committed in Belgium, which even the higher-up German wealthy Americans, who both basically ran the money in the country at the time, started to speak out against Germany, even to the point of sending strongly worded letters to the Kaiser himself, which we have some in museums. Well, they were very wealthy, so not supporting the Kaiser was a big deal. You know, they weren't sending money there anymore. It was all the big banks. Despite all this, the sentiment for neutrality won out, mostly backed by... Oh, sorry, I said this. Next! We had the Germans. Did something really dumb. They sunk a ship called the RMS Lusitania, which was a British passenger ship, which, unknown to the Germans, had just left port in New York City and was full of Americans.
Ruh-roh.
The British also had a big hand in this by cutting the transatlantic cable and cutting off their connection to Germany. So America only got British news, which made it seem like the Germans were the worst things in the world, knowing that they would be a great ally. Ensuring this with the transatlantic cable, the sinking of the Lusitania, people in America, it was basically ensured that we didn't like Germany. And American banks would start to make huge loans to the Entente powers, which were being used to buy ammo and raw materials. So we were just throwing money at Britain and Germany. Britain and France. We're throwing money at them.
Right.
Didn't really help the Russians much. America wasn't big fans of the monarchist government back then, so didn't want to help them.
We still kind of have a problem with that.
Yeah.
I'm proud of that.
Yeah. We never really... I mean, in World War II, we helped Russia a lot, but you're right. Back then, they were monarchists, and even communists we saw as better than that.
Yeah, basically.
Woodrow Wilson himself did not want war, and in fact, he actually only won the 1916 election due to his anti-war platform. In 1917, Belgium and France were occupied by Germany, and the Allied forces were in a rough spot. They were very low on credit, they couldn't pay back America, and the Russian Civil War had gotten them taken out of the war completely. Germany was looking to have the upper hand, but the truth is that Germany also was out of food and bullets. The Allies didn't know this, but it looked bad for their allies. The British invention of this thing called the tank gave them had them spend most of their money with the French. There was a joint effort to invent the tank, and they dumped a lot of their money in that instead of feeding their own men.
Yeah.
The Germans began the policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, and in the process would put an order out to avoid any ship with a red, white, and blue flag with stars on it, and fearing of waking the beast. Germany was so afraid of America at this point that they even tried to convince Mexico to join the Central Powers and attack the southwestern United States to get back Arizona and Texas. United States...
Mexico's like, fuck that.
Well, they never really got it because the United Kingdom at the time, Great Britain at the time, I should say, encoded the telegram known as the Zimmerman telegram. They intercepted it, and they immediately got this and gave it right back to the president and said, look what the Germans just sent your neighbors down south. And so the USA got it, and this caused enough outrage that Woodrow Wilson gave his famous speech calling for, quote, a war to end all wars. And on April 6th of 1917, the United States would declare war on the German Empire. America would land on the Western Front come summer of 1918. American troops were literally feared by the Germans and even the British at this time due to this thing called the Wild West, which still was very much around. And the tall tales they heard of this land with the cowboys and the bandits and the cattle rustlers and all that kind of stuff. That's what people thought of America.
And some of it's true.
And what I wrote next... Their fears would be proven valid. At the Battle of Cantigny, where a village held by Germans for years since the beginning of the war fell to Americans in half an hour.
Oh my God.
Not having time for trench warfare, the Americans just said fuck that and built roads over it and just ran right into the town with their shotguns and grenades and took out all oppositions. General John Pershing would order the Americans to not give an inch. That's the famous line as well. which
Right.
would end up being costly, as despite their ease in taking the town, the Germans really needed this back to hold their lines and would assault in wave assaults for 2 days, costing 1,000 American lives. But the Americans did hold the town. This was followed by a massive German effort, a large offensive to attack Paris, and within 50 miles of the city, the Americans decided that they would attack as the French retreated. This is where a well-known saying of the United States Marine Corps, who were leading the line at the time, saying, quote, "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?"
Right. Mm-hmm.
The Americans began, after that line, their 3-week battle that started on June 6th of 1918 and caused debilitating losses for both sides, but the Americans came out on top with the famous telegram saying, quote, "Woods now U.S. Marine Corps entirely."
Oh.
That's a very it's in the World War I Museum, I think, in the UK, is that telegram. That's they were just waiting to hear news back, and that was what they got.
It's like, that's like the best news you can get.
Yeah.
Hey, we did it. Oh, great.
This battle also
ours.
began the legacy for the United States Marine Corps that still exists today, which was a battle in the woods of France that had the newspaper headline, which is proudly treasured by the Marines today, that says, quote, "U.S. Marines smash the Huns," end quote. That was written by war correspondent Floyd Gibbons, who actually lost his eye during the battle.
Oh, shit.
And this battle was no joke either. This was no quick victory for America, as we would lose 10,000 Americans there. And it would be followed quickly by a major German offensive into the woods. This would be the Germans' final offensive of the war, and they would find no gain here, being defeated by the American forces handily, which would be followed by the American-French troops pushing into Germany in the Meuse-Argonne campaign, which would end the war, with the Germans signing an armistice on November 11th, 1918. The end of the war came with celebrations around the world, and even the new Germany that would be celebrating the end of all their death of their people. Troops came home, however, to a completely ruined country, and while the country itself actually didn't see war, like there was no battles in Germany. Germany was intact.
Right.
But the country was in absolute shambles.
Yeah. You had a population that just doesn't exist anymore.
It's not only that, the armistice was extremely hard on Germans. Way too hard.
Right.
Way too hard.
Right.
There
was a comment earlier when you were playing a World War I game that said, like, if the armistice wasn't as brutal on Germany, maybe the sequel wouldn't have happened.
100%, which I agree with. That 100% would not have happened if they didn't do this. What it basically did was they had to disarm and be occupied by British and American forces who would establish military bases to rule over Germany until 1930. Germany had to hand over their entire arsenal of 5,000 artillery pieces, 25,000 machine guns, 1,700 airplanes, 5,000 trains, 5,000 trucks, and 150,000 military wagons. Germany had to give the Alsace-Lorraine territory back to France, and the country was teetering on a communist revolution. They were given massive debts to pay back to the British and other allies that they would never, in a million years, be able to afford. And this all paved the way to the rise of a certain individual in the coming years.
Yep.
On November 11th, 1919, President Woodrow Wilson declared that the day would become a hallowed day known as Armistice Day, which would become a permanently legal holiday in 1926, which is known as Armistice Day in other countries. The Commonwealth of Nations, it is known as the Remembrance Day. And today in America, known as Veterans Day.
You know, I probably knew this about the Armistice Day title. I probably knew that's what it was back in the day, but I totally forgot. And I definitely think that, Veterans Day is a nice, what America is good at? We're really good at watering down holidays to Armistice Day, specifically World War I, about remembering a very brutal time in our history. We Americans just go, make it about all the veterans. Fuck it. Why stop there? And I understand that, and I agree with that, but it's definitely very interesting. It's not so much necessarily a criticism as much as an observation.
Yeah, it was. It's hard to criticize it because it's good to have a day to celebrate all veterans.
Oh,
Like,
I
it's
think
good.
that's
It's
true. I
it's
think
very true. And it was 1954 when they did it, and the reason why was the Korean War was like they're like, we need to have this include Korean War veterans and World War II veterans.
Right.
You know, because there was so much of that. Because Memorial Day also exists, and that's for the Civil War. That's where that exists.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's you know, so they just turned the Armistice Day into Veterans Day, which is like we just talked about. Americans lost a lot of people in the war. They had a lot of casualties in the First World War, but it wasn't as much as the others. And we were in it at the very end, so it's like it's hard for us to say. It would be hard to keep it as just a day to honor just World War One veterans, you know, in America.
Right. Especially seeing as we were way more involved in the next one, and then so on. You know, I always I'm always very like critical of certain things like government and authority, and typically the generals and people who point the fingers. But I'm always trying to like point out just like veterans and people who sign up aren't necessarily those people. They're not the people who go to war thinking about, you know, making sure we lock down a good sale for weapons and oil and stuff. Like, they're really going to war because they're worried about their home. And I think that that's something that's very special, and it often is forgotten about, is that it's like, look, the people who are going to war aren't often motivated by corporate profits and being in power. They're often motivated by, like, you know, really important things, you know, like making sure certain styles of government, like tyrannical ones, rise up and stuff like that. So, and in the case of World War I, that was kind of a messy war for sure. But World War II, you know, a little bit more cut and dry there.
Yeah, I have some numbers to end the episode off. Some fun numbers for us all to learn about how many people fucking died in this war. You ready for these?
Yeah, let's go.
So I'm going to start off with the United States. At the time, we had 92 million people in our country. That was our total population. And our total deaths was 117,465.
Okay.
That's 0.13% of our population.
Yeah. Still pretty... I mean, still a lot of people.
Yeah.
Still a lot of people.
Yeah, a lot of people. And then I'm going to go ahead and look at Australia. That was a big... They were a big part of the war. Gallipoli, you know. 61,928 deaths.
How much was their population?
4.5 million. So
how many deaths again?
61,928.
Got it, okay.
1.38% of their population. New Zealand, 1.1 million people, 18,000 dead, 1.64% of their population.
Goddamn.
And to top off the Commonwealth, we got the United Kingdom, 45.4 million people, 885,000 deaths, which is 2.19% of their population.
God. Jesus fucking Christ.
Belgium, 7.4 million population. Military deaths was 58,000, which is 2% of their population. France, 39.6 million people, 1,397,800 dead. It's the highest number we've seen. This is the highest number we've seen so far, with the lowest population for a major power, which is 4.29% of their population.
God damn, dude.
Italy, 35.6 million, 651,000 dead. That's 3.48% of their population.
So stupid.
And that's... I'll do Russia for the last part. No, two more countries to go over in the Allies. Russian, 175.1 million people, which compared to everything we've seen before, Jesus Christ, dude. Like,
I know.
Fuck. Like, America was second with 92 million. They have 175.1 million.
I know.
1,811,000 dead. That's 1.89% of the Russian Empire.
That's so many people.
Yeah.
That's still so many people, and that's still such a small percentage of their overall population. It's still so
And
many
now
fucking people.
we go to the most devastating percentage number of the war, which is Serbia.
Oh, I bet.
4.5 million people in their country. 275,000 deaths. That's 16% of their people.
God damn, dude.
16% of their country died in World War One.
You know, so you definitely know somebody who died.
Yeah,
like,
you probably
basically.
know someone who
You
died.
Absolutely know.
Probably multiple. That was just the Allies. Now, looking at the Central Powers, we can actually go over all of them because there's just four of them.
Right.
Austria-Hungary had 51.4 million people in their country with 1,100,000 deaths, which is 3% of the country. Bulgaria had 5.5 million people in their country, losing 87,000, which is 3.41% of their people. The German Empire, 64 million people, with our highest number so far of dead at 2,050,897. That's 33.82% of their people, and an even bigger number, 4,247,143 wounded. The Ottoman Empire had 21.3 million people in it, with 771,000 deaths at 13.72% of their population, the biggest percentage on the Axis powers, or Central powers, I should say.
Man, losing a war really costs you, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. And also part of the armistice to talk about right now is the fact that the Ottoman Empire had to be taken apart piece by piece and made into a bunch of countries by people who weren't Arab, weren't Turkish, weren't Persian, weren't any kind of people around that area, decided the borders. And that will lead to problems existing in 2022.
I was going to say, that's why we were here.
So, there you go. That's the end
Not
of the
that
armistice.
the Ottomans were keeping their shit together themselves, but...
No, absolutely not. But they should have decided that the leaders of their cultures should be the ones put in charge, not German, French, and American, dude. British, French, and American, dude. Yeah. Like, come on. And guess what happened again in the next World War?
I don't know what.
That's the end of the Armistice Day episode, everybody. Happy Veterans Day. I hope you got the day off of work, at least.
I do.
I do, too.
That's why I can do whatever I want tonight.
So have a good night, everyone. Thanks for listening to me talk about World War I for another hour.
Yay. Bye.